So here's another one of those questions that has a million and one answers. Why did Christianity become the sole religion of the Roman Empire eventually? Why was it the one that beat out all the others? So instead of having all these multitude of religions, Christianity became eventually the sole religion, not only of then the empire, but the rest of Europe, almost up until today. Well, like most good questions, there are a lot of very good answers, and there's a lot of terrible answers to this. And also, like a lot of really good questions, one answer to that question probably isn't sufficient. You probably need to put together a lot of different factors. And like a lot of good questions, sometimes one of those factors is this wonderful paradox of an answer. So today on this Good Friday, I would like to give you an extremely paradoxical answer as to why Christianity became so popular to become so dominant. And that is exactly what Paul claimed, was that Christianity is based on foolishness for the Greek and a stumbling block for the Jews. More specifically, Christianity is based on the crucifixion of the human Jesus. What do I mean by that? Well, there were a lot of different religions that had somewhat similar stories in terms of the death and resurrection of a god. I'll give you two that you probably are familiar with, at least tangentially. If you remember back to your Greek mythology, you might recall the myth of Demeter. Demeter was the goddess of the harvest, of fertility, of grain, and she had a beloved daughter named Kore, or you might know her as Persephone. And Persephone was kidnapped by Hades and taken down into the underworld. And when this happened, Demeter, of course, was distraught. She was beside herself. And while Kore was down in the underworld, the world went fallow. And no crops were growing, and everything was a complete disaster. Eventually, a compromise of sorts gets worked out, and Kore or Persephone comes back to be with Demeter 6 months of the year, and the other part of the time of the year she is down with her new husband in Hades. Hence the seasons, right? Another one that you've heard of this god, but you might not know that he had a fertility aspect connected to it, much like Demeter and Kore, is Baal, that famous scourge from the Old Testament that was constantly being combated, and his shrines and high places constantly being torn down. Well, Baal, besides just being a storm god, also had a fertility aspect to him. There was also a myth of him descending into the underworld, having been rescued and coming back up, and thus creating fertility, crops, growth again, the seasons. Okay, but neither of these stories, or really any of the other stories out there, have a lot of pathos that you can really connect to. And it's not like if you had the death of a loved one or some kind of tragedy. I don't know how well you would be consoled if your young son just died and someone came up and said, but remember Demeter and when Kore went down to the underworld. And you would say, so my son's going to come back in a couple months? Oh, no, but there'll be a harvest. So there's that. Not a lot of comfort really given there. But now let's contrast those with the death of another god, and this account given specifically in Mark. Up until the crucifixion story in Mark had gone through great pains to show the authority and the power of Mark, and he had identified him as the Son of God. So Jesus is doing teachings, he's doing miracles, exorcisms, etc. And he is really showing his authority as the Son of God. But if you read the Passion account in Mark, things change a little bit in the perception of how Jesus is being portrayed by Mark. Instead, now Jesus is coming across as very relatable and very, very human. Here's a couple highlights. He's abandoned by all of his followers. The disciples in the Gospel of Mark really do come off terribly, and there is no real redemptive arc for them either. It's kind of an interesting thing we'll get into later. But then you have, not only is he abandoned, Jesus shows a lot of fear and a lot of distress. And I'm going to read you Mark 14:34 through 37. And he said to them, This is when they're up in the Mount of Olives, by the way. And he said to them, I am deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here and keep awake. And going a little further, he threw himself on the ground and prayed that, if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. He said, Abba, Father, for you all things are possible. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I want, but what you want. He came and he found them sleeping, them being the disciples. And this happens another 2 times. 3 times Jesus goes and he prays this agonizing prayer of having the cup be lifted from him. 3 times he comes back to find his best friends not even able to stay awake. He's betrayed then by one of his best friends, Judas, as we know. And in Mark, when he is taken to trial, he offers no real defense of himself. He's silent. He doesn't say anything until finally, when asked, are you the Messiah? He says, I am. He suffers physically. It's described. He is beaten. He's blindfolded. He's flogged. And then eventually crucified. He's stripped naked, mocked. He's adorned in a purple robe with a crown of thorns and worshipped in an ironic way. He's executed as a criminal in the worst way that the Romans could think of. And the Romans knew a lot about how to execute and how to hurt people, as you probably know. There are no redemptive or repentant robbers on the side of Jesus. Instead, both people are being, he only says in 1532, those who were crucified with him also taunted him. So there is no remember me, the Son of God. So he is completely alone. And he is so alone that when he dies, his final words, he cries out, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which is Aramaic for, of course, my God, why have you forsaken me? It is after he dies that the centurion says the confession of, quote, truly this man was God's son. I'm going to leave you 2 thoughts with that. One, I think it's interesting, and I've heard some scholars say that the better reading for what the centurion is doing there is that is not a confession or an epiphany or recognition whatsoever, that should be read ironically. And if you read Mark, just as Mark is full of irony, of dramatic irony. And you could see that this centurion, after mocking and beating this man and worshiping him as a king of the Jews, and then he dies, just like the centurion has seen hundreds of people die crucifixion before, and he says, yeah, right, there's God's son. Moving on to the next one. But the irony is, we as the reader have already been told, and we already know that he truly actually is. I would also encourage you, if you have time today, my God, why have you forsaken me, as probably most of you know, are the opening lines to Psalm 22. And I would encourage you to go and read that psalm today in its entirety, because it brings so much more context into what Mark is saying and placing those final words in Jesus' mouth, because it is a literary device. It's a lot like if you have friends and you guys have quotes that you know, whether it be a song or from a movie or a poem, that you can communicate in shorthand, that you can just say a couple words of a quote and everybody would know in the room, oh, I know exactly what you're talking about there. It's the same thing in terms of quoting the first words of a psalm. Everybody would know, oh, that's Psalm 22, and then they would know the whole psalm by heart, just like you would know the whole, words from, again, I have 4 kids, Let It Go, from Frozen, from heart. But what we're faced with here is Jesus' suffering is portrayed in Mark as true suffering of a true human. There's fear, there's distress, there's agony, there's pain. So why was Christianity so successful compared to other religions? I would give this humble sliver of an answer as part of a bigger picture. Perhaps it's that it gives people a real, tangible Savior to relate to. Jesus was not simply some God-man. He was a real human being as well. He grieved. He was distressed. He was lonely. And he really suffered. And throughout history, for many, many, many people, life is nasty, brutish, and short. Jesus, as he is portrayed in Mark, is just the kind of Savior that can speak to that person who suffers, because he himself also knew that suffering. Well, happy Good Friday, everybody. I hope that you socially distance and do it well. Take care of yourself, take care of each other, and be your brother's keeper.